Everyone, and welcome to this live demonstration of my approach to revising a research paper. In this scenario, I am revising a research manuscript, and I'm going to walk you through my process for how I would take peer review comments and organize them into a template, and what my three-step process is for sort of creating an action plan for tackling those comments. And then I'm going to take you into a manuscript and walk you through the revision process, how I would approach it. And then I'm going to open it up for questions. And so this research manuscript is a manuscript that I sort of created for the purposes of this demonstration. So this isn't an actual manuscript that one of our community members wrote. It's actually based on my dissertation. I kind of chopped it up and made it have some obvious errors so that we would have something to work with. But the peer review comments are based on types of comments that I frequently see from peer reviewers. I'm a reviewer for several journals. So these are the types of comments that I would often provide. So I tried to make them as realistic as possible. So with that said, before we go into the manuscript, I want to show you this peer review comments template. This isn't something novel. If you go online, there's even some journals provide a template for peer review comments. I just tried to put everything in one place for today's demonstration. And so this is the template here. As you can see, it's very simple. There's three columns. The reviewer comments are organized by reviewer. Let me color code this one. Then you have a column for the author response. Today, that is me. And then the page and line number. And so if you can imagine, whether it's a research manuscript or perhaps you're writing a dissertation or thesis and you've received feedback from a supervisor, you can copy and paste those comments into this template. And you'll put one reviewer comment in each row. You can obviously add rows as needed. I recommend organizing the comments in the order they would appear in the document. And then in the response column, you're going to describe what was changed and provide a page and line number where the change can be located in the document. And then depending on the journal, if this is a research manuscript situation or what your supervisor requests, you may need to highlight the changes within the document itself and or use track changes. It just depends on who the reviewer is and what they're looking for. And so this is an example of a table. I have it color coded. I'm going to explain the color coding in a moment. But essentially, we have one comment. This is everything for reviewer one comment per row. And then I haven't gone through and made the revisions yet, so there's nothing in these columns. And so let me explain the color coding, because this is my process for trying to create an action plan. I think sometimes we can get frozen or overwhelmed by comments. And so jumping into action, I think, is important so you're not procrastinating. And so this is how I tackle reviewer comments. First, I look at comments that are based on organization. Comments for organization could be anything that requires a simple, let's say, cut and paste. It could be, maybe you need to conduct a reverse outline and revise, several paragraphs or a section of writing. Content, these types of comments, let me put content here. There's a lot that falls in this category. It may be a comment that requires you to go back into the literature and get more information. Maybe you need to add missing content, remove content, and replace it with more relevant content. This is where these two categories, the organization and the content, cover a number of different sort of tasks and activities. And I'm going to give you some examples, so hopefully it'll become more clear. And then editing is just what it sounds. I also include like APA 7 style changes under editing. So again, editing could be maybe it's running the spell check. It could be proofreading. It could be APA 7 edits. It could be some minor formatting. Basically, I don't want you to edit until everything is in its place. It doesn't really make sense to sort of edit the content if you're going to move it into a different location. And I always think of editing as low-hanging fruit. It also requires, I think, less of a mental lift. And so I tackle these more difficult comments first. That requires maybe some critical thinking. Sometimes it requires you to like really step back and reflect on the comment. So let's go through these here. We're going to scroll down and I'm going to walk you through how I categorize these comments. So let's look at reviewer 1 comments. So reviewer 1 said, the purpose statement in the introduction is awkwardly placed and should be moved to the end of the introduction. Well, I have this under organization, which is in black, because this requires a simple cut and paste from the introduction, the beginning of the introduction to the end. This comment says, I believe there is a more recent IOM report since the release of the 2003 report. Please update. I categorize this as content because it's going to require me to take a look at that content, go to the source and see if there's a more recent update and potentially replace what's there, remove it. It requires me to think about that piece of content itself. We have another comment here. The reviewer said, you state, few studies have examined, this is a duplicate. Few studies have examined the experiences of the frontline faculty who must ultimately implement curriculum changes. Is this true? The reference is outdated. So this is a comment that is related to content. So I put that in green. It's going to require me to really think about this claim that I'm making about few studies. Maybe I need to go back into this reference, into this source to consider whether or not there's more recent literature. I might likely need to do an updated literature search. So I'm engaging with the content here. And then without reading all of these, you can see that I've also categorized these as content. This is a simple content change, address IRB approval. So I'm just adding a sentence about IRB approval and the methods. Here's another comment that I categorize as organization. It says the discussion needs to be reorganized. That's a hint, as it's hard to follow. And then they've kind of given me some advice about what to start with. And then here's an editing comment, update all in-text citations to reflect APA 7 guidelines. So again, I don't like to do these first because perhaps within this process of adding or removing content, maybe you get rid of some in-text citations. So in this scenario, I don't think it would be a great use of my time to go in and correct all the in-text citations if some of them are going to change. So I would save that for the very end. So for reviewer 2, I haven't color coded these yet, but I do already have them in order that they would appear within the document. And so I'll just go through these and color code these so I'll walk you through my thought process. So reviewer 2 said information in the methods that discuss the curriculum change initiative need to be moved to the introduction to provide context for the study. So for me, this is a simple cut and paste. As of right now, it may be that when I go into it, it requires some content change, but I'm going to categorize this as an organizational comment. And now we have a question about the purpose of the 3 interviews. I would put this as content. It's going to require me to add content to the manuscript to explain the purpose of each interview. We have another question about content. Did you reach data saturation? Another comment about content. The results are thin. Add participant quotes. This comment is about the discussion and conclusion are hard to follow. The conclusion should offer a clear declarative concluding statement and address implications for future research. So I think this can actually be broken into 2 separate comments. So I'm going to actually add a row here because the first part of this comment is organization. I'm going to have to go back and potentially reorganize the discussion and conclusion sections. But this is a content related comment because it's going to require me to go through the conclusion. I'll probably have to do some cutting. But I might need to completely rewrite this section based on this comment. And then here's an editing comment. This is similar to the first one, so that will be killing like two birds with one stone in terms of the in-text citations. But this one is also more general than the reviewer one. It just says manuscript needs to be updated. So I'm going to have to go back to the APA manual to consider maybe what I missed outside of just the in-text citations. Okay, so that's my process for color coding the reviewer comments to give me a plan of attack. And so to go back to my process, I'm going to start with the comments on organization. Then I'm going to tackle the comments on content. And I might need to go back to organization. So these two areas are typically iterative. As you change one, you might need to go back and change the other. But first, I'm going to try to work through all the organization comments first, and then go to the comments related to content, saving the editing comments for last. So I'm going to minimize this. We have a split screen. And this is the research manuscript that I am revising. I'm going to just skip over the abstract for now. And I'm going to pull up the table so that it's beside me. Let me just put this on one page. Okay, so organization first. So I'm doing the comments in black or organization. So the first comment, the purpose statement and introduction is awkwardly placed and should be moved toward the end of the introduction. So the very first sentence here is the purpose statement. And keep in mind, you may not agree with some of the comments, and that's okay too. You can state maybe why you disagree and justify your response in the author response column. So let's just, for the purposes of this demo, let's just assume that I agree with at least most of these comments. So I'm just going to take this here. I'm going to cut it. So I'm hitting Control-C, and then I'm scrolling down, and I'm looking at this section of material that transitions to the methods. And because I'm familiar with my writing in this manuscript, I do know that it's going to be appropriate here. So I'm going to just cut and paste the purpose statement here. And obviously I'll proofread this once all the revisions are made to make sure that it flows. So I'm going to put that there. And then this comment says, I believe there's a more recent IOM report since the release of the 2003 report. I know that I mentioned the IOM report in the intro, so I'm actually going to do a find and search for IOM, in this document. Yep, right here, IOM 2003. Let me see if there's another one. Nope, that's the only time it's mentioned. And I'm going to highlight this to go back to it later. Okay. Oh, I moved on to content. Let me jump to the organization. I didn't mean to do that. I'm going in order. So the next organization content comment says, the discussion needs to be reorganized as it is hard to follow. Instead of starting with recommendations, start by discussing each theme. So let's scroll to the discussion. All right, the discussion starts here at the top of page 7. Let me just, to give you an idea of how long it is, we have 1 page, 2 page, 3 pages. That's a lengthy discussion. And the reviewer says that it needs to be reorganized because it's hard to follow. And then they give me some advice. Instead of starting with recommendations, start by discussing each theme. So the first thing I would do, instead of, because we don't have time for me to revise this entire section in front of you, I'm going to show you how I would go about revising it, what my plan of attack would be. If someone's telling you that the writing is hard to follow, there's a couple of reasons that could be. It's not going to be obvious up front unless maybe they tell you exactly why. But as a writer, my first thought is, okay, maybe I should do a reverse outline to go back and identify what the main idea is in each paragraph of the discussion. And then I can look at those comments and think about, okay, maybe there is a way I can go through and cut and paste and move paragraphs to get started. So a reverse outline just means you're reading through and you're tagging the main idea within each paragraph. And I always put it in a comment bubble so that it's easy for me to look down the margin and check the organization that way. So you could think of it as that's going to be your outline in those comment bubbles. And so if I'm skimming through this, I can see that there's a few main ideas here. So we're stating that oral health has not been included, it's posing challenges. And then talking about how educational institutions must adapt, how they've shifted, how oral health curricular integration is in alignment with this reform. And so this is, I would just broadly categorize this as, let me go into my comments. Health care education reform is what I would broadly categorize this as. So I'm going to add that comment here. And then I now see what they're talking about, looking at this with fresh eyes. I start this next paragraph about a key change in educational policy. So I'm making a recommendation about educational policy, and then I link it back to the theme. And so I'm going to see where that switches. This starts a new idea. So I'm going to add a comment here that says educational policy recommendation. And then this transitions to oral health competencies, HRSA recommendations based on those competencies. And this is a more practical recommendation. It's not necessarily based off of policy. And so I'm going to add a comment here. And then I see, again, it's becoming more clear what they mean about it's difficult to follow. So then I'm jumping to the findings of the study have implications for current and future educational practice. And then there's specific recommendations for practice. So say this reads more like an organizing statement for that section of information. This addresses overall study findings. This seems unnecessary. I'm already noticing that I probably want to cut this because that was in the introduction. And so I'm not going to keep going through all of this, but you can see how the reverse outline, you'd be able to look in the comments and see, okay, there's some clear issues here with the flow of this information. And that can help you sort of more quickly determine how you need to restructure this information if you end up keeping everything in this section. So that's how you start building a reverse outline. You could even go into creating a new Word document where you cut and paste these into a new outline and start strategically pulling the information from the old document into the new document. I find that that is sometimes easier than trying to work within a specific section of writing, because it can be hard to keep track of all of that information. Yeah, I'll just stop there instead of completing that whole section because hopefully you get the idea. So then if we go to reviewer 2, here's an organization comment. Information in the methods that discuss the curriculum change initiative need to be moved to the introduction to provide context for the study. So if we go up to methods, they are referring to this information. In 2019, the university secured funding over a 3-year period. And so I know that I'm going to move this because I agree. I think it is contextual, but I'm not sure. Let's just say I don't know where I'm going to move it yet, especially because I know that there's going to be some content changes in this manuscript. So my process for doing that is if I don't know where it's going to go yet, but I know it needs to move, I'm just going to say add this context to the introduction. That's a note for future me later. I'm going to put that here. I'm just going to highlight it so I don't lose track of it. And then this reviewer has also commented on the discussion being hard to follow. And so my hope then would be, as I work through the reviewer one comments, some of the reviewer comments around the organization here would naturally be addressed. But the first reviewer did not comment on the conclusion. And so again, anytime something is hard to follow, my brain first goes to, let me do a reverse outline. So I would take that same approach with the conclusion, which is 1, 2, 3 paragraphs. And I would quickly add a comment to show the main idea of each paragraph. And so this, if I just kind of take that same approach here, I have purpose statement followed by overall findings. This is summary of overall findings. So notice that if I'm presenting overall findings twice, perhaps some of this is repetitive and can be cut. I'll decide that later once I do finish the reverse outline. And then this reads more like a recommendation. Okay. So when I do that, it is clear that there's some issues here with this conclusion. But again, I'm not going to go through and make these changes in front of you because that would be too time consuming, but at least you know how I would tackle them. So now let's look at some of these content changes. So let's go back to this one, page 3, line 21. Oh, it got moved down. Talk about experiences of frontline faculty who must ultimately create and implement curriculum change. I'm going to type in front so I can find this. Here we go. So this is the statement they were referring to. So this comment would require me to really think about this. Maybe in this scenario, maybe I wrote my dissertation, 3 years ago. If I started writing the introduction and the lit review 3 years ago, perhaps this citation could be updated. And so this is going to require me to go back into the literature and see if I can find some updated literature, or perhaps I can defend this because it is the most recent source for this statement. And so that is something that is going to require me to go out of the document and into a research database. And so I'm not going to do that right now. I'm going to continue working through the document. So this is like an idea of task batching. So a task that requires me to sort of exit the document and go into maybe Google Scholar or a library database, I would batch those tasks together. And so I'm going to leave myself a note here and just say literature search. So now I'm sort of breaking down the content comments so that I can batch those tasks together. So these are similar tasks that need to happen for these 2 comments. This one, however, is a comment related to content that just says address IRB approval in the methods. So in the methods, I could add a sentence about IRB approval. IRB approval was obtained. Just imagine that I finished that sentence for the sake of time. So completed. That's what I would write as the author. And then once all the revisions are made and the page numbers and the line numbers are final, you would add the page number and the line number here. But obviously we know that's going to change, so I'm not going to put that here right now. And then this requires me to go back into my results. So as you can see here, the results are pretty thin. We just have really 3 paragraphs that provides an overview of the themes without any participant quotes. This is a task that is going to require me to go back into my data. So I'm going to revisit data. Maybe I'll say transcripts. Maybe it's in vivo. So that's a different task. I'm going to see if there's other tasks that are similar to this so I can do those together. So I'm not going to immediately do that. I'm trying to work through this efficiently. So let's just skip through some of these instead of working through them all. This is another comment about what was the purpose of the 3 interviews. Well, I know in my methods section, says data collection followed Seidman's 3 interview series. So let's say that I don't agree with this comment because I have a word count limit. I've cited Seidman's 3 interview series, and I don't feel that I need to describe the purpose of each interview because I know that Seidman's, that source, describes the purpose of each of the 3 interviews. So I might say something along the lines of, thank you for this suggestion. However, I cited Seidman 2006. This source explains the purpose of each of the 3 interviews. Therefore, I don't believe this information is relevant due to, not relevant, is needed due to the word count limit. Okay. And then data saturation. That's a comment that I can directly address by going into the manuscript. So again, for the sake of time, I'm just going to pause here and restate the point that the task batching that happens within categories is really important. So if I were to keep going through this, you would notice that if I can go ahead and immediately address the comment within the manuscript, then I'll do that now. But if it requires me to move on to a different type of task, like searching the literature or revisiting my data, or even reading an article that I know I have, then I would put a note for myself so I could do those tasks together before going back in and revising the information within the manuscript. And so through this process, as I've noted here, I may have to go back and forth between content and organization because the changes required for the discussion and the conclusion are much more extensive. I may need to, and I likely would in this scenario, start writing a separate discussion in a different Word document where I'm reorganizing, I'm creating a new outline based off of my reverse outline, I'm cutting and pasting information from the old version, perhaps adding new content, and then bringing the new version back into the research manuscript. And that may impact what I have mentioned earlier in the paper, because there's a ripple effect. When you make one change in maybe the introduction, it can impact the information you have in the discussion and the conclusion. And so it's really important to, at the end of this process, to check the alignment within your document to make sure that you didn't inadvertently introduce an alignment issue with these changes. And so at the end of the day, you'll have a revised manuscript, and this will be a complete reviewer response table. This is helpful for you for enacting your action plan, and it's helpful for your reviewer. It helps them know exactly what your response is and where they can find that revised information within your draft. So I'm going to pause here